It's funny how certain nights stay with you forever, etched in your mind like a bad dream you can't shake. That summer, my cousins and I decided to spend a night at my grandfather's old countryside house. It wasn't my first time there, but something about it always gave me the creeps. The place was ancient, with its weathered wooden walls and a roof that groaned in the wind. It stood alone, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow the last light of day. We were supposed to have fun, just a group of teenagers, no parents, no rules. The plan was simple: stay up all night watching horror movies. It sounded like a great idea at first. We joked about who would chicken out first, though deep down, I think we were all a little on edge. The house itself didn't help. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the trees outside, felt louder, more alive than the silence of the countryside. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house was cloaked in shadows. My grandfather didn't believe in modern luxuries like Wi-Fi or central heating, so we were completely disconnected. The only light came from the dim bulbs overhead and the glow of the old boxy TV we had set up in the living room. We started with a few tame movies, stuff that was more funny than scary. But as the hours stretched on, we decided to step it up. That's when someone suggested The Conjuring. "Let's see who's brave enough for this," my cousin Luke said, grinning as he popped in the DVD. I laughed it off, but my stomach was already twisting in knots. The opening credits rolled, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had been a night of laughter suddenly felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. None of us noticed then, but the night was about to take a turn we couldn't have imagined. The movie started, and the room fell into an eerie silence. We huddled together on the worn-out couch, the only sounds being the creaking of the old house and the unsettling whispers from the film. I'll admit I was on edge, but I wasn't about to show it. The others seemed just as tense. No one cracked a joke or reached for the snacks anymore. About halfway through the movie, just as a particularly chilling scene unfolded, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from the window behind us. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Luke paused the movie. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all nodded, our eyes darting around the room. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident. But even as I spoke, my voice wavered. Something didn't feel right. We resumed the movie, but the unease lingered. Minutes later, it happened again, this time louder, more deliberate. The sound seemed to echo through the room, and I could feel my pulse quicken. My cousin Sarah, the youngest of the group, clutched my arm. "What if it's not the wind?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her it was nothing, but before I could, Luke stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "No, don't," Sarah protested, but Luke was already at the door. We followed him, hesitant but unwilling to stay behind. The night outside was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim glow of the flashlight. As we stepped onto the porch, the cool air sent a shiver down my spine. We scanned the area, looking for anything that might explain the sound, but there was nothing, just the empty yard and the dark expanse of trees beyond. Then we saw it. On the side of the house, faint but unmistakable, were marks, crudely drawn crosses, all inverted, scratched into the wood. "What the hell?" Luke muttered, his voice barely audible. My heart was racing now, a cold dread settling over me. The marks weren't there earlier. I was sure of it. We stared at them in silence, the air thick with tension. It wasn't just the crosses. It was the way they seemed to pulse with an unexplainable energy, as if warning us to leave. "Let's go back inside," I said finally, my voice breaking the silence. Now, no one argued. We hurried back into the house, locking the door behind us. But as we settled back into the living room, the weight of what we'd seen hung over us like a dark cloud. For the first time that night, we weren't just scared of the movie. We were scared of what might be lurking outside. Or worse, what might already be inside. Back inside, the house felt different, heavier, colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in on us. No one dared speak, and the silence was so intense it seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old wood. Luke broke the tension, his voice strained but steady. We should check the rest of the house, just to be safe. I didn't want to, but the thought of sitting in that living room, waiting for something to happen, felt even worse. We armed ourselves with what we could find: flashlights, a broom, a rusty kitchen knife, and split into pairs. Luke and I took the upstairs while Sarah and Mia stayed below. The staircase groaned under our weight as we climbed, each step echoing like a warning. The hallway at the top stretched out before us, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through a single dusty window. The doors to the bedrooms stood ajar, dark and foreboding. We moved cautiously, peeking into each room. The first two were empty, just as we'd left them. But the third one, the room at the end of the hall, was different. The air inside was ice cold, and the faint scent of iron lingered. "What's that smell?" Luke whispered, shining his flashlight around. The beam landed on the far wall, and my stomach dropped. There, etched into the peeling wallpaper, were more inverted crosses. They were crude and uneven, as if carved in a hurry. "This wasn't here before," I said, my voice barely audible. Luke nodded, his face pale. He reached out to touch the markings, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I warned, the unease in my chest growing stronger. A sudden thud from downstairs made us both jump. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Sarah and Mia," Luke said, and we bolted down the stairs. We found them in the kitchen, standing frozen by the back door. Sarah's flashlight was pointed at the window, her hands trembling. "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing. Mia turned to us, her face pale. "Something was outside," she whispered. "We saw it." "Who?" Luke asked. "Not who," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "What?" She gestured toward the door. There, smeared across the glass in what looked like mud or blood, was a handprint. It was too large to be human, the fingers long and claw-like. We stared at it, the reality of our situation sinking in. This wasn't just our imagination or a prank. Something was out there, something that wanted us to know it was watching. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." But as we gathered our things, the tapping started again. This time, it came from every window, every door. The sound was relentless, surrounding us, trapping us. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. We stood in the living room, clutching our makeshift weapons, the silence more deafening than the noise. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. No one had an answer. All we knew was that we weren't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let us go so easily. We huddled in the living room, backs pressed against one another, every shadow and flicker of light a potential threat. The silence was unbearable, yet none of us dared to break it. The handprint on the kitchen window felt like an unspoken promise that this wasn't over. Luke tightened his grip on the rusty kitchen knife he'd been holding. "We can't just sit here. We need to figure out what's going on." "Figure out what?" Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. "We're trapped. Someone is playing with us, and I don't think they're going to let us leave." I wanted to reassure her, to offer some logical explanation for the madness unfolding around us, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew she was right. A sudden creak above us shattered the stillness, and we all froze. The sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, as though heavy footsteps were pacing across the upstairs floor. Mia's eyes widened. "There's someone up there." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "We were just upstairs. There's no one." Another loud creak cut me off, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. It was slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be explained away by the wind or the house settling. "We're not staying here," Luke said firmly, grabbing the flashlight. "We're checking it out, together." None of us wanted to move, but staying put felt even worse. Reluctantly, we followed Luke up the stairs, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway stretched out before us, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The noise led us to the door at the end of the hall, the same room where we'd found the inverted crosses. The door was slightly ajar, and cold air seeped through the crack, chilling my skin. Luke pushed the door open, and the flashlight illuminated the room. It was empty, just as we'd left it, except for one glaring difference. In the center of the floor was a single wooden chair, its surface scratched and splintered. On the seat was an old, tattered doll, its porcelain face cracked, and its eyes unnervingly lifelike. A note was pinned to its chest with a rusted nail. Luke stepped forward and plucked the note off the doll. He unfolded it with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the words. "It says, 'Don't look away,'" he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. As soon as he spoke the words, the door slammed shut behind us, plunging the room into darkness. Mia screamed, and I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly it nearly slipped from my grasp. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam landed on the chair. The doll was gone. "Where is it?" Sarah cried, her voice on the verge of hysteria. Before anyone could answer, the dragging sound started again, this time coming from the corner of the room. The flashlight darted toward the noise, revealing the doll slumped against the wall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were fixed on us. "We need to leave," Luke said, backing toward the door. "Now." But as we reached for the handle, the doll's head snapped upright, and a raspy, childlike voice filled the room. "You're not going anywhere." The door refused to budge. Panic surged through us as the doll's chilling words echoed in the room. Luke threw his weight against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah clawed at the walls, her sobs filling the oppressive air. "Let us out!" Mia screamed, her voice cracking. The doll remained slumped in the corner, its unblinking eyes tracking our every move. I held the flashlight steady, illuminating its eerily lifelike face. The words it had spoken replayed in my mind. "You're not going anywhere." Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and the flashlight began to flicker. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human. Luke raised the knife in his hand. "Stay together. Whatever happens, don't split up." But before we could form a plan, the walls around us began to vibrate, the sound low and guttural, like a deep growl emanating from the house itself. "It's coming from the walls," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The growl grew louder, the vibration stronger. Cracks began to form along the plaster, spreading like spiderwebs. Then, without warning, the doll in the corner rose to its feet, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Mia let out a blood-curdling scream. "It's moving! Oh my God, it's moving!" The doll took a single, halting step toward us, and the shadows on the walls began to converge, taking on a more solid form. The outline of a figure emerged, tall and menacing, its features obscured but its presence undeniable. "Who are you?" Luke demanded, his voice trembling. What do you want from us?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out with an elongated, shadowy hand, pointing directly at me. A cold, suffocating dread washed over me, and I felt as though it was reaching into my very soul. "Don't look at it," Sarah shouted, covering her eyes. But it was too late. My gaze locked with the void where its eyes should have been, and an overwhelming wave of nausea and despair crashed over me. My knees buckled, and I dropped the flashlight. The room was plunged into darkness. I could hear my friends' frantic voices, their footsteps as they scrambled to find a way out, but my body felt paralyzed, as though the entity had drained the strength from me. Then, amidst the chaos, a voice whispered in my ear, soft and menacing, yet unmistakably clear. "Your time is up." The flashlight flickered back to life, and in its beam, I saw Luke swinging the knife at the figure. The blade passed through it like smoke, and the shadow recoiled, reforming behind him. "Run!" Luke yelled, shoving the door with all his might. This time, it burst open, and we stumbled out into the hallway. The house seemed to come alive around us. The walls groaned, the floorboards shifted, and a deafening roar filled the air. We ran, barely able to see in the flickering light. As we reached the staircase, Mia tripped, tumbling down the steps with a cry. Luke and I rushed to help her, but when we reached the bottom, she was gone. "Mia," I called out, my voice cracking. Only silence answered. "Keep going," Luke urged, pulling me toward the front door. We burst out into the night, the cool air hitting our faces like a slap. Behind us, the house loomed, its windows glowing with an eerie red light. Sarah collapsed onto the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. We left her. We left Mia. But before any of us could respond, the front door slammed shut behind us. A moment later, the house went dark, as though it had swallowed itself whole. We stood there, breathless and broken, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The nightmare wasn't over, but for now, we were alive.